Muito bom dia, Sr. Embaixador Armindo de Brito Fernandes, Diretor-Geral da CPLP, Sr. Embaixador do Canadá em Portugal, Élise Racicot, Sra. Professora Claudia Mitchell, bem-vindos à CPLP. Gostaríamos de cumprimentar todos os nossos pontos focais para a igualdade de género e empoderamento da mulher que nos seguem em linha, bem como todos os observadores consultivos e observadores associados que se juntam a nós nesta sessão. A nossa sessão, como sabem, como foi divulgado, irá abordar o tema Gender Transformation. Será feita uma apresentação por parte da Sra. Professora Claudia Mitchell. Esta apresentação terá tradução simultânea, pelo que pedimos às pessoas interessadas em seguir a apresentação em português que possam mudar no canal de interpretação para o canal em português, logo que a Sra. Professora Claudia Mitchell comece a sua apresentação. Mas antes disso, vamos passar a palavra ao Sr. Diretor-Geral da CPLP, a Sra. Embaixadora do Canadá, para umas primeiras palavras de boas-vindas. Sr. Embaixador, por favor, tenha a palavra.
Muito obrigado. Excelentíssima Sra. Embaixadora do Canadá em Portugal, Élise Racicot, excelentíssimos Sr. Representantes Permanentes dos Estados-membros, junto da CPLP, excelentíssimos Sr. Representantes dos Observadores Associados da CPLP, prezados Sr. Representantes dos Observadores Consultivos junto da CPLP, prezados pontos focais da Igualdade de Género da CPLP, excelentíssimo Sr. Diretor da Cooperação da CPLP, cara oradora Professora Claudia Mitchell, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. É com elevada satisfação que gostaria de apresentar os meus cumprimentos a todos os presentes e enaltecer a realização da presente iniciativa, que assinala, ainda que simbolicamente, o início da dinamização conjunta de atividades entre a CPLP e o Canadá, na qualidade de Observador Associado da CPLP, numa área prioritária da agenda de cooperação da nossa comunidade. Remonta a 2000 a primeira Conferência de Mulheres da CPLP sobre Género, Cultura, Acesso ao Poder, Participação Política e Desenvolvimento, que teve lugar em Salvador, e contou com a participação de delegações de Angola, do Brasil, de Cabo Verde, de Guiné-Bissau, Moçambique e de São Tomé e Príncipe, e membros do Conselho Nacional de Resistência Timorense, em representação do território do Timor, do Loroçai. 22 anos mais tarde, em abril do ano passado, em Luanda, participaram da 7ª reunião dos ministros responsáveis pela igualdade de género, ou seus representantes, de todos os Estados-membros, reafirmando o compromisso da comunidade com a igualdade de género. Mas também reiterando a importância do setor da cooperação assume na e para a CPLP. E é por isso que consideramos relevante a realização de eventos coletivos que hoje assistiremos, uma vez que permitem conciliar os interesses nacionais dos Estados-membros em termos de defesa da educação e da saúde, incluindo a saúde sexual e reprodutiva das mulheres e meninas, bem como a imperiosa necessidade de promoção contínua de uma participação igualitária no mercado de trabalho, no acesso aos recursos e no processo de tomada de decisão política. É neste contexto que a reunião de ministras e ministros responsáveis pela igualdade de género da CPLP tem destacado a importância da promoção da igualdade de género e do empoderamento de mulheres e meninas como aspectos fundamentais e potenciadores do crescimento produtivo e desenvolvimento socioeconómico sustentável, bem como da melhoria das condições de vida e de bem-estar social das comunidades dos nossos Estados-membros. No que se refere à presente iniciativa, acresce referir que vários atores institucionais têm se juntado à persecução dos objetivos e valores e princípios partilhados pela CPLP, entre os quais se destacam as organizações internacionais congêneres, incluindo as agências da Organização das Nações Unidas, Estados terceiros que obtiveram o estatuto de Observador Associado da CPLP, como é o caso do Canadá, instituições da sociedade civil que obtiveram o estatuto de Observador Consultivo da CPLP, redes de trabalho colaborativo que se vão constituindo em diversas áreas setoriais da organização. A abordagem desses aspectos visa tão somente partilhar o âmbito alargado em que se encerra a realização da presente iniciativa conjunta, que se encontra alinhada com o Plano de Ação 2022-2024 para a operacionalização do Plano Estratégico de Igualdade de Género e Empoderamento das Mulheres da CPLP, aprovada pela reunião de ministros responsáveis pela igualdade de género da CPLP de Luanda. Mas também fazendo realçar a importância amplamente transversal que as questões de género assumem na concretização da Agenda de 2020 para o desenvolvimento sustentável e objetivos de desenvolvimento sustentável da Era do Corpo. Resta importante agradecer a Embaixada do Canadá pela oportunidade de concretizarmos em parceria este momento de reflexão conjunta, a ser impulsionado pela professora Claudia Mitchell, da Universidade McGill, na certeza que poderá constituir um marco inspirador da dinamização de futuras ações entre a CPLP e os observadores associados. Votos de uma excelente palestra. Muito obrigado pela vossa atenção.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Diretor-Geral da CPLP. Temos o enorme gosto de passar a palavra à Sra. Embaixadora do Canadá em Portugal, Embaixadora Élise Racicot.
Muito obrigada. É um grande prazer estar aqui hoje junto com os participantes que estão lá, especialmente aqui na sede da CPLP, para o primeiro evento conjunto entre o Canadá e a CPLP. Esperamos que seja o primeiro de muitos e que seja o início de uma colaboração muito positiva, eu que acredito que com certeza será. Antes de começar a palestra, eu queria também oferecer alguns pensamentos sobre a questão de igualdade de gênero no contexto atual. A gente estava a falar de alguns dos objetivos da CPLP, seja em termos da promoção da língua portuguesa, seja em termos de desenvolvimento econômico, enfim, em várias áreas. E acredito que, como o senhor diretor-geral falou, em todas as áreas tem um poder transversal nessa questão de igualdade de gênero, que pode ter um impacto positivo em tudo. Por quê? Porque, no final das contas, é só quando todo mundo participa do desenvolvimento que resultados realmente podem ser vistos. E para que todo mundo participe, tem que ter igualdade e equidade de gênero. Para que esses 50% da população, que são as mulheres, possam também contribuir e participar. Espero que hoje as palavras da doutora Mitchell, que está aqui conosco, possam ser uma inspiração, um começo de uma reflexão conjunta entre o Canadá e a CPLP sobre maneiras de enxergar, dentro de todas as organizações, como a gente pode utilizar essa perspectiva da diversidade e inclusão, partindo da mulher, mas também para outras áreas de inclusão e diversidade, para transformar nossas organizações e render elas, quem sabe, mais justas, mais equitáveis e melhores em termos de atingir os nossos objetivos de desenvolvimento. Acredito que vocês vão ouvir um pouco hoje sobre questões como análise de gênero, sobre orçamentos baseados em gênero também, gênero budgeting, como a gente fala no Canadá, que são conceitos muito práticos, muito implementáveis, vamos dizer assim, e que realmente podem trazer uma grande repercussão. No Canadá, ainda hoje, a gente vê essa repercussão, temos caminho também para ser feito dentro do nosso próprio país, mas a gente acredita que isso sejam ferramentas muito concretas que podem ser utilizadas por qualquer um e que realmente podem trazer uma melhoria. Então, muito obrigada por essa oportunidade de trabalharmos juntos, e esperando que seja o primeiro passo para uma colaboração mais ampla, sempre com foco. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Embaixador Élise Racicot, muito obrigado pelas suas palavras. Vamos então dar início à apresentação por parte da Sra. Professora Claudia Mitchell. Convidamos a quem nos segue online a passar para a interpretação em português, se for esse o vosso desejo, para poderem seguir da melhor forma aquilo que a Sra. Professora vos vai apresentar. A Sra. Professora Claudia Mitchell irá fazer uma apresentação sobre o tema Gender Transformation, políticas que promovem a igualdade de género nas organizações. Professor Claudia Mitchell, once again, welcome to CPLP. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'll just...
I will ask my colleague to put the presentation on screen for everyone to follow.
I'm just putting it on my screen as well. I'm nearsighted. I won't be able to see the screen so far away. But thank you everyone for receiving me this morning or this afternoon, or I guess it's this morning for us. Somewhere else it could be earlier in the morning. I have been spending the last 2 days and from politicians to gender, business people to ambassadors, and I'm very happy to meet what I think is the entire Lusophone population of the world, a representation plus other countries as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I call it gender in the works as a topic for the many different strategies and the many different tools that I think we need in order to think through how do we bring about social change, and in particular, how do we disrupt social norms. And I think this is very much the agenda of feminist foreign policies, but I think it's very much the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals that we're all working with and working towards for 2030. I think we see equity as being part of how the world becomes a more peaceful world, a world in terms of addressing environmental issues, and really how we think about the broader good for all of us. I'm going to talk I can read this very well. My eyesight has improved. So I'm going to be talking really about gender transformation in organizations today. And this work is something that I was mentioning to a group earlier today, how I was actually part of the preparation for Beijing 1995. So I have been doing this work for quite a long time. And had the very good fortune to spend time in Zambia in 1994, working with the group there, preparing for the Dakar regional conferences, and then later Beijing in 1995. In particular, from that, my university signed an agreement to do a very large project in South Africa, starting in 1996. And I believe South Africa was the country that really, where we saw the political aspects of equity so clearly. It was a country in 1996 that was totally trying to start everything anew. And I know so many other countries who are represented today have also done that, had to start anew. Like, what structures need to be put in place? How do we think about gender focal persons? How do we think about what structures can matter to make the kind of broad sweeping changes? And so the project that I was involved in was really to support the Gender Equity Task Team in South Africa in 1996 and 1997 to do that kind of work. And I think my early experiences there they were, I guess, a recognition of how long change will take. That was, some years ago, 27 years ago, almost. Mathematics and me on Zoom, I've lost track of many years ago. But also recognizing what it took, what kinds of policies had to be put in place, but also how long it takes to make change. And I think that that's something we have to think about as we go along. What is it how long does it take, and what structures can happen, and how do we actually get at what we call deep transformation of a society, and not just the superficial, although the superficial is also part of it. I think we have to start with wherever we are. So for this presentation, I want to talk really about some of the ways that we're thinking about gender transformation as a policy that the Canadian government has, but many governments have in relation to thinking about international assistance, and a few examples of some of the work that we've been doing, some of it in Mozambique. So I have a couple of videos from Mozambique, but then also thinking back to how organizations can study themselves. And I think that that's a really critical part of this work. I hope that we will have lots of chances for questions as well. And if we don't get through all of the PowerPoint slides in the time, because I'm a professor at heart, and I always have more PowerPoint slides than we will necessarily ever can get through in a class. But I would just ask you to bear with us and in terms of timing, and we will make available all the PowerPoint slides after the presentation as well. So I'm just going to jump right into the notion, next slide, which is really trying to think through what are some of the gender mechanisms that we've been looking at over the years to think about change. Don't look at the first one very closely, I guess. It was really gender negative. Thinking through all of the policies and all of the laws that we had that kept gender equity from happening. I know in many countries there, and some in Canada, where women were not allowed to work, or women were not allowed to teach if they were pregnant. Women could not necessarily buy property without their husband's support. We know of many forms of legislation that were gender negative. They deliberately set out to deny women certain rights. So that's at one extreme. We moved into, I think, something called gender blind, which really said we were not really going to look at everybody is the same. And with the idea that we won't have any negative policies, but we don't necessarily have any affirmative policies. And the gender blind was really, I see it many times to say, gender doesn't matter. Everybody's equal. We saw that actually doesn't really help to bring about the kind of change that was necessary, although it was better than gender negative. And I think some of the policies, even around access to toilets, we just have, everybody will have the same toilets, but actually we've seen, I think, in many African countries, that meant that girls often didn't go to school because they were having their periods. And so unless there were separate toilets for girls, they would not be able to attend school. So this idea of gender blind is not the answer. Then we had something called gender targeting, which said we're going to count. We're going to see where are we, and we're going to try to make sure that we have equal representation, or we're going to have more representation. And targeting is definitely better than gender blind. It means that we are moving along. We're saying we actually need to know, what are the numbers? Where are people? How are we going to say, how many women do we have to have in the legislature? Or how many women do we have to have in public service? But it was a counting mechanism. It wasn't necessarily a mechanism that sought to really bring about profound change. We then moved into something called gender responsiveness. I'm really trying to begin to address what are some, how do we really look at some of the setting the agenda and really thinking through, well, maybe we have to really specifically think about girls and women in this situation or that situation. And again, a progression over gender targets, gender responsive. But I think where we are heading now, and this is, I think, part of Canada's feminist foreign assistance plan. It's part of many of the assistance plans around the world, is to think about gender transformation. How do we actually disrupt the gender norms? How do we actually say, we want to get at not just the superficial, but we want to get at the root causes of gender inequality? And how can we actually begin to think through what that might look like? So I kind of put those out there. You might think about where are you in some of your own policies, or where you are in your own families to think about this work. But the notion of gender transformation is what I want to concentrate on in the next couple of slides, and to think through, how do we get there? How do we arrive at this idea where we have really tried to get at the bottom of what is gender equality, and also the root causes of gender equality, and how do we think about this in a truly disruptive way of bringing about social change? So I'm just going, if I'm going too fast, I'm not sure if I'm going too fast. Well, we'll just move into this next slide. So really to think through that gender transformation actually subsumes many of the gender mainstreaming policies that were set up in 1995 at the Beijing conference. I think gender mainstreaming was really such a radical idea in 1995 to think through what would it look like to have gender on the agenda for every single aspect of policy frameworks. Where we saw the limitations of this, and that was radical in 1995, but I think in the revision, or in the revisioning of Beijing 25 years later, I think we saw how many people embraced mainstreaming as a very broad concept, but then it often ended up being a ticking of the boxes and not necessarily deep change. Maybe also thinking of it as a bureaucratic structure, but not necessarily a profound, I guess, a reflexive process. And I think that's something that we'll talk about in a short time. And that maybe we need more than we need systems to change, but we need to understand why the systems need to change and what are the kind of the underlying principles of that. And the notion of gender transformation then really starts with the idea that we want to go beyond this. It's not just having gender at every element or at every aspect of policy, but thinking about it in terms of culture, thinking about it in terms of many differences, but also thinking about it as having it be genuinely thinking through where women and girls have been and where we want them to get to. So I think that these are, I feel like we were talking about this on the way over here. So like an ongoing process, but thinking through what new strategies can we use that really try to get at this notion of disruption. So just go to the next slide, which is, I think, we will go to the next slide. We can go to the next slide.
I'm trying.
Okay, sorry.
But I believe my colleague is also no social. No, não estou conseguindo agora.
We'll never go to the next slide.
This is the next one.
I don't know how that. Can we just go advance 3 slides and then come back to? Sorry, I think it just got out of order.
This one?
Yeah. Yes, but
Or the next one?
it's the next one. Oh no! Oh my goodness! How did this happen? It's very embarrassing. One more. There. Okay, yes. Okay, thank you. So beware of people who switch their slide presentations at the last minute. Things could be in the wrong order. My apologies. This is a framework for how some of the key principles that the Canadian government has been looking at in its foreign assistance programs, but also in many countries around the world. And I recently was reviewing how many countries have something called a gender transformative approach as kind of the key principles for thinking through where do we go next. And the number one piece of this, and I think this is something that maybe differs from where we were around mainstreaming in the 1990s, is this commitment to a participatory agenda, where the voices of girls and women are heard. And I know we talk a lot about girls and women and empowerment, but we now have, I think, policies that say if you are going to look at a new work around girls' education, agriculture, the environment, climate change, health issues, where do we start in relation to consultation with girls and women? And the notion of a participatory agenda that says we should be starting with those people who are most affected to be helping us to consult with the issues. And this piece, a commitment to a participatory agenda, I think is something that I know Global Affairs Canada says, if we are applying for a project on whether it's environmental issues, whatever the issues, where did we start with in terms of the stakeholders? And where do we start with in terms of girls and women? And women's organizations to think through how do they see the issues? How do we genuinely, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of looking at, we use a lot of visual methods, but these could also be focus groups. There could be many different forms of consultation as a starting point. And as I say, we'll look at a couple of examples in a few minutes. We also, I think, recognize something in 2023 that we weren't quite sure about in 1995, and that was what role do men and boys play in gender transformation? And I was just at a previous session where we talked about this. How do we think about men as allies and champions of change. I think we've recognized that half the population cannot support the whole population in terms of social change, and that this could be in families, this can be in schools, this can be in the workplace, this can be in government, this can be in defense, this could be in healthcare, that social change and a gender transformative approach really relies on not just women holding this up, women being very critical to this work, obviously, but that how do we think about men and boys as allies in this work? And so what are some of the examples that we will try to look at are some ways in which, even if we're talking about issues around gender violence, we're talking about workplace change, how do men and women work together? How do we see the issues? What are some of the questions? What are some of the strategies that we need to be looking at? And now within I was thinking of Global Affairs Canada, but also some of our various government organizations. This is something that we look at when people develop a new policy or develop a research proposal. How are they going to consult with girls and women? But where do men appear in this? How are men going to be brought along and involved as allies and champions? So this becomes a very, I think a deep change for those of us who've been working around gender for a long time. We've often thought that this isn't women's work, but this is everybody's work. And gender at work means men and women working on these, not necessarily always in the same room. Many times we have to be in separate rooms. But at some point we have to bring our work together. And I think that this doesn't necessarily say that every single activity around gender has to have men and women sitting at the same table at the same time, but eventually we do. And so the process itself is very, very important. A third piece that is, I think, very important in gender transformative work is the notion of personal transformation. I know that everyone, I can't see you on the screen, but I know you're there. I know we're in the room together here, but we don't really do gender or think about gender transformation at some sort of a societal level or a policy level or at any level effectively. We don't actually think about it in terms of how it appears in our own lives. It could be in our own personal lives at home, but it's also our own personal lives at work and our own relationships. So I think this is something that didn't appear, I think, in 1995, but I think is very present in 2003 of thinking through that social change starts with ourselves and the kind of work that we're doing around something so radical as how we interact in the world has to involve ourselves as well. And so we find increasingly, when we develop research policy, research grants, when we develop grants within Global Affairs Canada, with other funders, where does reflexivity come in? That notion of being able to reflect on how is this working? How are we doing in this? And that doesn't mean that as an individual, my voice takes over in a research project that I'm writing about, but it does mean that there should be some engagement by self, regardless of where it appears in the actual reporting. So the idea of personal transformation is a part of this. And I know all of you who are in various offices around the world, gender is also about you. You are your own work and your own families and your own workspace and your own ability to navigate that space. We also, the next piece on this as a principle is really thinking through, this is a messy process. It's not something, we sort of think, oh, we'll put a whole lot of policies in place around gender transformation, and voila, it will all be there. And we know that that's just not the case. And as a if I was looking at a funding proposal for research, I would say people just write in all of the things of what they're going to do, but not build in how they're going to deal with these unplanned consequences. We had an example yesterday. We were talking about if you increase the minimum wage in a country, and consider who are the people who are most likely to be the recipients of minimum wage. They're probably women, or they're probably in various minority groups. So increasing the wage for a minority group or increasing the wages for those people who are most likely in that category will also have other consequences in families and in communities. So just one piece of something can change the relationship with other people. Thinking through, if you have managed in an organization where you have incentives for certain groups, at McGill, we have an equity, diversity, and inclusion program where we try to attract more Indigenous people. We try to attract more women into certain areas that have been previously male-dominated. We've tried to attract other racialized minorities. We might have to put in special incentives to do that. We know that if you just leave things as they are, perhaps nothing will happen. We might have to provide more incentives to women to take on management positions. Will this have a consequence in the organization? Will there be resentment? Will there be other information that you need to provide? So I'm really just putting it out as an idea that when we make some changes that might seem to be affirmative for one group over another, we should also take into consideration that what does social engineering do and what else do we need to take into consideration. We also recognize that there are other tensions that may take place as part of the agenda. So it's really just acknowledging that I think at a certain point we thought, well, we put in mainstreaming policies and that suddenly everything will change. But recognizing these tensions are part of the work and they're part of what we document. And we learn as much from the tensions and the disruptions about how it is that we are trying to engage in this particular process. And then finally, this notion of, well, how are we doing? This is probably, I'm not sure how much people have done in terms of monitoring and evaluation, but this idea constantly of where are we on this agenda? If we say that we need a participatory agenda with girls and women, well, how are we doing on that? If we say it's absolutely vital to involve men as allies and champions, how are we doing on that? How are we doing on personal transformation? This notion that, do we know what success will look like when we get there? So it's kind of like that awareness constantly of thinking through this idea of how are we doing? How are we going to get there? Yesterday, we had a lot of discussion about domestic violence here in Lisbon or in Portugal. And of course, it's a very big issue in every country around the world that I'm aware of. But how are we doing and where does one policy, yesterday we talked a lot about the idea that emergency shelters are absolutely critical for women. But then how are we doing and does what long-term consequences that might that have? And we might have more shelters, but it might mean that then people see shelters as the answer, not actual transformation of social relationships. So it gives us an idea of this. So these are just some very broad principles. I know at the moment I'm going to totally mess up on the slide, so I'm going to go back maybe for just going back the other way. Yes. So here's an example. Okay, of the voices of girls and women as a key feature of social change. This is from South Africa. I'm going to move to Mozambique in a second. But one of the key issues for rural young women in South Africa is forced and early marriage. This came from the girls and young women themselves. in a project that we were working on addressing gender-based violence in rural areas. We were imagining that it was about date rape. We were imagining sugar daddies. We were imagining, or the researchers that I'm working with had many ideas about what they thought were going to be the most critical issues for girls. One of them perhaps even being teachers having sexual relations with students. When we started working with the group, they talked about many different issues. These were girls between the ages of 15 and 19. But the one that they talked about more than anything else is that their parents were forcing them into marriages. They were looking at, the parents were looking at the economic necessity of having their daughters married off. And this was in a time, I mean, South Africa has extremely, I think it's one of the most impressive constitutions in the world in relation to equality. But the lived experience of girls on the ground in rural areas is quite different. And so the girls started talking about how they didn't want to get married. They wanted to go to school, they wanted to stay in school, they wanted to go to university, they wanted these things, but they didn't really know how they could convince their parents of this, because it's not really, it's more subtle. They just knew that these things were going to happen. So in the project, we invited them to make small, short videos about their experiences. We called them cell films. And they did role plays where they acted out many different scenes of what was happening. They were stories. They were telling stories about the types of things that would be happening to them around what, their father saying, oh, no, this man over here, he's for you, you'll have a lovely marriage or whatever. And they were talking about how they didn't want to do this and how they wanted to stay in school. They made these videos, and they were to the research team, we learned a lot. But we also recognized that as a research team, we don't actually have any say over what happens in families. We have some say about learning from their experiences, but we don't actually have any say about what's going to happen to them next. But what we did find is that the girls said they wanted to actually have a march. And if you look at the placards, they were a whole group that, they had all sorts of things about, we don't want rape, we don't want to get married. As researchers, our main job was to make sure that we had police escorts so that nothing would happen to the girls and young women. But the most important thing, and if you look at the bottom slide, you might see a circle of people in a community forum. And the girls they showed their cell films. And people talked. These were their parents, these were teachers, these were the chief, the whole community came to watch these 1-minute videos or 2-minute videos about the issues the girls saw. And from there, things changed. The girls couldn't do very much more. They had marched, they had made their voices heard about why this was so important. But it took the next step of the adults in the room to say, we have to listen. We have to listen up. We have to do something. And the chief this is from Loscop, it's an area near the Drakensberg. The chief, some of the other elder government members went to Peter Maritsburg, where the provincial legislature is, and they brought forward something that they called the Loscop Protocol, which says that parents are responsible for really ensuring the safety of their daughters and really ensuring that the idea of forced marriage is something that is really contravening the girls' rights, but also contravening the possibility that they are going to get to stay in school, maybe go to university, maybe do something else. It's an example of listening to the girls, taking their words seriously, but then putting in mechanisms, including mechanisms that involve men. In the community forum events, they included both women and men, and people debated this. People had dialogue about it, but that's an example of, I think, a piece of gender, moving towards gender transformation, because it's acknowledging that a fundamental problem, if girls can't go to school, if they can't stay in school, if they can't go on to university, if they want to, if they can, that those are just a whole key range of experiences that are going to have long-lasting impact, both for them, but for their children and their children's children, or conversely, has incredible emancipatory possibilities for them, for their children and their children's children. So I think that's as an example of listening to and thinking through what the consultation might look like. Do we have time for another example here? I'm going to go to a video. I think it's back one. One more, I think. Yeah, here. Before we play this, we're going to Mozambique. And this is a project around gender-based violence and working with beginning teachers and teacher instructors. This was an area that was identified by the project. It was a project funded by CODE, which is primarily a literacy and gender project that was and funded through Global Affairs Canada. When we talked about the idea of boys and men as being key to this, in the same setting, we asked young men and young women to make short videos about what they saw as the issues around gender-based violence. And I'm going to show you, this is the video you're going to see is about 30 seconds long. So you have to listen very carefully. But just to say that it is an enactment of they're Teachers College students who have identified that one of the key areas in higher education is that male teachers and professors often have relationships with their female students. And again, in terms of inequity, in terms of difficult relationships, and in terms of the identity of the girls and young women, this is obviously very detrimental. Three young men got together, and this is their video. So we'll just watch it. They're enacting, they're role playing being professors.
Colega! Ei, colega! Tô feliz! Consegui aquela minha aluna da turma E. Aquela clarinha? Aquela é minha! Parabéns! Colegas, eu ouvi a vossa conversa. Assédio sexual nas escolas é um crime. Não! 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 Não!
No. So they're in there. They're right in there in terms of how they're seeing their role and making. I mean, that was by far the most popular video. I think it's gone viral because it's like and it's on the CODE website. I think Global Affairs might have it on there. I know in Mozambique, there's somebody from Mozambique on here. I think it's actually on the website for this. But I just want to show one other video that actually shows boys, young men and young women working together. We made a documentary called Self-Film when we were in Mozambique, where people were talking about these issues of gender-based violence. But then we went back to one college and we worked with a film crew who actually filmed the group who had made self-films. And now they're now reflecting. Remember that reflexive process I mentioned? They're now reflecting on what they did and why it's important, and why it's important in their own lives, as well as in their lives as teachers. So let's just watch, I think it's about 3 minutes long, of they're talking about their own experiences of what it meant to make these self-films about gender equality.
A opção de self-film porque eu faço coisas que as mulheres fazem, pilar amendoim, cozinhar, mas os meus irmãos diziam, olha, você não pode fazer isso porque você é um homem. Mas com aquele vídeo que eu produzi, eu posso levar para minha casa, chegar e mostrar o vídeo, olha, as coisas são assim, a equidade do gênero. E eles podem entender que nós todos somos iguais, podemos fazer qualquer coisa, não é que a mulher não pode fazer isso e o homem não.
Com o seu filme, eu pude aprender que ainda há necessidade de explorarmos mais esse tema de igualdade de gênero. Assistindo algumas filmagens, eu pude perceber que há necessidade de explorarmos mais esses temas nas escolas.
O aluno, nesse momento, vai dizer, lembra do filme que o professor trouxe, o que dizia? Então, aqui não há diferença, que nós somos iguais. Se é para jogar futebol, todos nós vamos lá jogar futebol. Se é para brincar nega, todos vamos brincar nega. Então, aqui não há diferença. E essa parte que nós queremos que os alunos...
Uma vez vendo esse filme, a criança em si pode criar já a coragem de transmitir esse conhecimento para os pais.
No papel, mas em algum momento eu fui criativa, implementei mais algumas coisas. Eu era muito insegura para aparecer perante as câmeras, desprezava alguns detalhes mesmo, então eu descobri muitas qualidades em mim mesma na realização de self-filmes. Então o meu autoestima melhorou muito.
E falando de mim, no papel que eu tive de ser professora, sedutora, foi um papel engraçado, foi um aprendizado. Eu nunca fui ousada, nunca soube me enquadrar. Eu, como para fazer aquele papel, tinha que eu me encarnar, ser uma outra pessoa.
E achava um pouco.
E foi meio difícil, mas mesmo assim foi algo para se superar. Eu gostei muito de ter feito aquele papel de professora.
Em algum momento nós transmitimos a mensagem ou a informação sem ter consentimento da própria transmissão. No sentido do que, se nós já temos um self-filme, lá fora, por exemplo, no corredor, começamos a nos chamar pelo nome tratado no self-filme. O self-filme, em algum momento, pode trazer um impacto na sociedade, mas se formos olhando no sentido pedagógico, desenvolve a oralidade entre nós e nas pessoas que também recebem a própria mensagem.
I think we had such a great sense of not just what difference it would make to their lives as teachers, but also what difference it made to their own families. And I mean, I love the young woman who says, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be the perpetrator, and having to, like, acting that out, how that changed her idea or made her think again about what this really means in terms of power and so on. And I think that those are just two examples. In this case, the young men and the young women now working together on this. So they made separate cell films in single-sex groupings, but then coming together and then making a new cell film to talk about this. That is the kind of work that I think in this notion of the participatory agenda of transformation, but also this idea of reflection and the idea that boys and men are champions and allies and champions of change in this as well. That how do we bring that along? And of course, I think education, whether it's formal education in this case, or whether it's the communication, education that we were talking about in LOSCOM, where it wasn't school context, in that forum, talking about why forced and early marriage was so difficult for them. They were educating their families, they were educating their parents and the chiefs, and in turn were then seeking further education as well. So I think education, whether it's in this formal or non-formal piece, is a very critical part of this. So I'm just going to move back on to I think it's called gender transformative approaches. If we can get back on track. I think it's the next. Yeah, yes. So really thinking this in a broad way, these gender transformative approaches aim to reshape gender dynamics by redistributing resources, expectations, and responsibilities between women and men, non-binary gender identities, but often focusing on the norms, the power, and collective action. And I think that's the example, when I looked at that, that's really what we're trying to think about. We think of it as a new paradigm for gender and development, really focusing on core feminist principles, and finally on an emphasis on social transformation, addressing the root causes of gender equality. And I think when we had the boy talking about going home and doing some of the cooking or making things, or that is, again, trying to think through where do we actually think of a redistribution of power in some way. I'm just going to move on to the next slide.
That's just a minute, please.
Okay.
The camera has switched down, so I need to reconnect it again. So
How much time should we use for the presentation? But 5 more minutes. Okay. Actually, I would think it's a new skip some slides because we only have 5 minutes. Just tell me when you're ready.
if you use the wheel, that's easy for you.
Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, that's good. Are we back?
Yeah, but the picture needs
Okay,
to be
sorry.
improved.
Just like being at home. We're always having a
But they are listening. You can proceed.
little techno. Okay. I'm just going to skip over some slides. I will send, I have all of the principles of gender transformation that I will send to you later. I should say for all the principles. Okay, the next. Okay, so what I'm just going to move into is to maybe thinking through some of the gender organizational pieces that you might want to think about in your organization or the groups that you work with. Assessing the facilitators and the barriers to gender transformation within organizational cultures. So when I talked about gender at work, I can also talk about gender in the workplace. And here are just some of the questions that I think we can ask ourselves. Does your organization have a gender policy? What does it look like? With the organizations that you work with, do they have gender policies? What do they look like? When we did some interviews in Malawi recently, some of the people said, oh, I heard there's a gender policy. There's a gender policy, but I've not seen it. I don't know anything about it, or I don't know anything about gender policy. So we would find when we actually ask people about these pieces, do they actually exist and has anyone seen them? How would you best describe the organizational culture in relation to gender in your workplace? People sometimes say gender issues are rarely discussed, they're sometimes discussed, they're often discussed in organizing. So it's a question that we might look at in terms of reflexivity. What actually is happening in your organization? And when gender is discussed within my organization, the conversation is best described as negative, somewhat negative, both positive and negative, somewhat positive or positive. So gender issues may come up, but is it a good thing? People say, oh, is that just women wanting more? Or how come they're getting incentives and we're not getting incentives? Or is it saying, oh, this is great. We're all working together on this particular policy. So it's a question I think that we can ask ourselves. How would you describe gender-based decision-making in your organization? Who decides on what's happening? Gender issues rarely, sometimes, often inform decision-making in my organization. So where does gender come into the actual decision-making process? We might also, these were some of the questions that we also ask. What do people, is it agree or disagree? Men should be allies and champions of gender transformation. Maybe not after I've been preaching this for 30 minutes, maybe you don't agree. Or maybe you think that there's a limitation to that, which of course we should talk about. Men within my organization are playing an active role in advancing gender equality. Men and women should answer that question. It's a question for everyone to say, oh, well, as a man, I do this, or I see my male colleagues doing this, or I don't see my male colleagues doing this. I want to make personal changes that will lead to gender equity. That could be in your very own personal life. I'm doing this, but actually I'm just realizing that I should send my daughters to science camp, and not just my sons. Or I should be encouraging family members, I should be encouraging everybody in the family to jump in and pitch in and clean the house. It's not just one person's job. So it's not, so again, a personal aspect of this. I want to learn new strategies to advance gender equity. Again, thinking back to how slow this process can be, and how it changes, and we all need education. So the fact that people will say, oh, I want to learn more about this, that's a positive sign. I'm willing to have my assumptions about gender norms challenged. That's something for people to actually say, oh, actually, I don't want to change, or that's scary. But that means that if someone says, oh no, we are fine the way we are right now. Thank you very much. Gender transformation involves challenges that may have unplanned consequences. I think that I mentioned it as an earlier piece, but that can be very disturbing to some people. We don't, our place is working really well right now. I don't know that we want to change. So it's again this idea of how these are all questions that I think we can use to assess how we can facilitate the process and also what the barriers might be. These were some of the questions that we asked in Malawi quite recently. And when it was one, I want to make personal changes that will lead to gender equity. It was actually very interesting. These are on strongly agree. In this case, actually, more men said that they were willing to make personal changes. How would you best describe the organizational culture in your workplace? This was an interesting one. The men from the same organization thought they spoke about gender more than the women did, which is kind of interesting. We wonder if there's like two conversations happening, but like, why is that? So it's a question that an organization might ask itself. And these are all, incidentally, questions that we asked in a survey, but then we sent the answers back to the organization so that they can have their own discussions, because these are for discussions. Or how would you best describe the organizational culture in your workplace? So in terms of this one, again, gender issues are sometimes discussed. The men thought that more often than the women. But this is a study done many, many years ago about language in meetings by a woman called Dale Spender in Australia. And there was the whole idea that if women spoke at all, it was too much at that time. And I think that was in the 80s. And I hope that now when we look at meetings that more women speak up. But at one point, when women spoke up at all, some men thought they spoke too much. So it was like this idea of points of relativity. And then one last point, how would you describe gender-based decision-making in your organization? The men were more likely to, they were talking about sometimes informing decision-making and thinking through what that meant in terms of men and what terms of that men, I think, thought this more. So I think we have to kind of think through how even people in the same organization see this. And then just this final slide, if you had to select the top 3 challenges, sorry, just the next.
You assume
I'm
you control the...
Sorry, I can't multitask.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going the wrong way now. Oh, sorry.
Use the word it is.
Okay. Where are we? I'm totally lost. Okay.
You're in the middle of the...
So thank you. So I'll just do this one last slide. Oops. Yes, the next. I think it's assessing. There it is. Yes. Okay. Sorry. That's very funny. Don't repeat this to anyone in Canada that I just did this. Okay. So if you had to select some of the challenges in your own organization, what are the top 3 challenges in achieving gender equality in programs and activities? How would you rate the impact of your programming on gender equity? And then finally, in your opinion, what is the single biggest barrier to gender transformation? I think those are questions to ask, and I do have one more slide. I'm sorry. Now you are. Now, Madam Ambassador, you are now. So it's okay. I just want to show one last slide that I invite you in your own organization to all of you get together with a camera and take pictures of what you think leadership and gender equality looks like in your organization. Sometimes we can't really put these into words. It was sort of like, oh, I think we are very gender equal. But if you actually had to walk around for maybe over one of your meetings, and everybody grab your cell phone and take pictures of what you think gender equality looks like in your organization, or what are some of the barriers to leadership or barriers to power or social change, what would they look like? And what would your pictures look like? And what kinds of discussions would you have? This is a group that we did, bringing together people from Botswana, Kenya, and South Africa. And people were just like really looking at their own organization and bringing them together. But I think the ideal is doing it in one office where everybody comes together with their cell phone, walks around, taking pictures of what does social change look like, or where do we want to go, or where are we right now? And I think, again, this idea of how do we work together on this? How do we think about this in terms of our own personal change, but also thinking through, how do men and women in our organizations look at this work as being something that's really significant to try to delve deeper, dig deeper into what these norms are that we're trying to address, and how we're doing them, we think we are making these changes with other people, but how can we also make them in our own organizations? So I'm going to stop there. Yes. If there are questions.
Como estava previsto, vamos então agora abrir um período para perguntas e respostas. A quem nos chegue ainda em Zoom, pediríamos que se identificassem, mas primeiro que levantassem a mão aqueles que pretendem colocar questões, para nós podermos passar a palavra, e nós aqui na sala passaríamos para o canal em inglês, para que a professora Mitchell possa compreender as vossas questões. Portanto, está aberto um período para perguntas e respostas. Queria só que a tela pudesse deixar de ser partilhada.
Para fora já está.
Para fora já? Alguém gostava de colocar alguma questão para a Claudia Mitchell? Well, Professor, it seems that no one is willing to put on a question. So everyone is enlightened with your presentation. I believe it was pretty clear, so no one has questions to ask. So we will make one question. First, I don't know if you, during your career, had the chance to look at the reality of the Portuguese-speaking countries in terms of gender equality, and if you have some proposals to leave for us to our organization. As Ambassador told in the beginning, we are very keen to implement our strategic plan on gender equality. This plan is a plan that was approved initially in 2010 and that has been revised accordingly to the ministry meetings that have taken place during the period of the presidency of CPLP, and we are now preparing a joint statement to the CSW in New York for next week. And in that statement, we say that this is a priority issue for CPLP because it's transversal, it impacts in all the SDGs, and we intend to continue to implement them. And as a matter of fact, there is an ongoing discussion to put it in the revision of the CPLP statutes as a norm, as a general norm. In terms of the executive sector of CPLP, we have to respect gender equality. Respect it, of course, but we want to make it clear in our statutes. So, do you have a final recommendation that you want to leave to us for the Portuguese-speaking community in terms of gender equality?
Well, I would say that in every context that I've ever worked in, communication is really key. That everybody understands what it means. That how to operationalize what this policy, what this statement is, and what it will mean for different people. I feel that I've seen countless examples where people hear about the policy or they hear about the statement, but they don't actually know what does that mean for me. And I think I think until you start doing it, maybe no one knows exactly what it's going to mean. But we know that without putting some clear, messages, clear statements, clear discussion about what this might mean, the chances are not so successful, they're limited because not everyone understands it. And earlier today at another meeting, we talked about feminist foreign policies. 11 countries now have a feminist foreign policy, but what does that actually mean? And it doesn't necessarily have to have one meaning, but it does have to have some very clear, clear features that help people understand that. So even those list of principles around gender transformation that I talked about, those are pieces that I kind of culled together from different areas because, like, oh yeah, we want to do gender transformation. Okay, well, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. So I think we would just really invite everybody to think through what will it look like? What you know, and at various levels, and to communicate that. And communication is often done through discussion, through dialogue, through having lots of opportunities for people to debate what it will mean for them. Or those questions that I put up earlier about, you know, who talks about gender in your organization? How are gender decisions made, and so on? Those are all part of, I think, an important dialogue. And I think without dialogue and without discussion, these pieces often become, oh, well, it's a policy there, or it's a statement. But, oh, yes, do we have a statement? Yes, we do. What does it mean? I don't know. It means something. We don't know. And I know in various policies that we've implemented, people have, in Canada, we have something called GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus. It was a study done several years after it had been implemented in a number of different organizations, and people were asked, what does the plus mean? And it was like, well, we're doing more. It actually means intersectionality, and we're going to look across race, class, gender, ethnicity, and so on. But actually, a lot of people didn't know what it meant. So it's like part of that.
If I may just jump in on this, and I'll do this in Portuguese, but I'll tell you what I said.
Okay, that's fine. Yes.
Talvez exemplo, no Canadá, quando a gente adotou esse princípio de GBA Plus Analysis, que a doutora Mitchell acabou de mencionar, na nossa organização, no Ministério de Assuntos Estrangeiros de Global Affairs Canada, a gente passou através de uma série de treinamentos onde todos os nossos funcionários, através do mundo, de qualquer nível que seja, tiveram que fazer uma formação de GBA Plus para entender o que é. Porque também tinha essas perguntas, né? Tem uma política nova, temos agora que usar isso em todas as ferramentas para tomar decisão, para adotar política, só que as pessoas não entendiam muito bem ainda o conceito. Então, teve um treinamento e foi feito para todo mundo e cada executivo dentro do Ministério tinha que se assegurar que todo mundo dentro do time dele tinha feito e tinha conseguido passar esse curso. Então, uma ferramenta talvez um pouco top-down, mas que acredito que funcionou até um certo ponto em termos de socializar a ideia. Então, só deixando essa experiência aqui para vocês.
Okay. Muito obrigado. Senhora Professora, foi prazer. Muito obrigado pela sua pleasure. Thank you for being with us during this morning. I hope this is the first of next presentations that you will deliver to CPLP, because it's Muito obrigado, Sr. Embaixador, por ter trazido a Professora Mitchell ao Secretariado da CPLP. Muito obrigado, Sr. Diretor-Geral, por ter estado na abertura. Muito obrigado a todos os que estiveram online seguindo esta sessão. Continuem connosco neste e noutros assuntos. Um resto de um bom dia para todos e até breve.